Well, I'm very excited today to be joined by David Crawford, a photographer who is based in Northumberland. But welcome, David. I'm really pleased that you've joined me on the Photopocene Podcast. And it's a really good opportunity for us to have a chat about your work and your photographic practice and how that relates to environmental issues, concerns, etc., the natural world, resources. Now, I've had a look at your work online, and you describe your sort of environment-related photographic work as perhaps exploring notions of transience that
Yes.
you want to, but through the work that you do want to retain this semblance of hope in the face of environmental adversity. What is it that you could say in your own words to let people know about the drivers then behind your photographic practice? What is it that's driving you in relation to environmental issues to create photographic work?
I think in relation to the environment, as I've said earlier, Josie, when you look at the evidence base, some of it is quite stark. If you read the works of a lot of scientists who are studying the demise of Arctic ice, then one can feel quite a lot of despair at times thinking about what that means going forward. But I also think there's something about we don't yet fully know what the future holds. So I like to think that in my work, that tension between a sense of transience and a sense of how, as artists, do we respond to the scientific findings. I suppose it's about responding to the landscape, but also responding to the interior landscape that is generated in response to the environmental issues. So rather than having that sense of despair, I like to think, well, perhaps there is some grounds for not knowing about the future, and can we respond with a sense of community? Can we respond with a sense of, well, we're all in it together, so how do we forge connections? How do we build conversations about the science, but also not just about the doctrine of science, but also how do we respond as individuals? How do we retain resilience? How do we retain a sense of, well, irrespective of what the science tells us, we still have an obligation to each other, and we still have an obligation to, irrespective of outcome, have a sense of community, even if it is about being stoical in our demise. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of sense of community and sort of the resilience. So using sort of your photography, the work that you create through photographic methods is relating back to that then, in a sense. Is that what you're saying? That
I think as artists, we respond as individuals to both the external world and also the interior world of sensation, emotion, cognitive responses. Lots of photography, I feel, is lost in technique. We get enthralled by the technique of photography, or we get fascinated by the devices of photography, and we get lost in sub-menus or what the algorithms or computer programs can do for us. And I think there's almost like a loss of connection with the humanity within all of that enthrallment. I do feel it's important to retain that sense of human qualities to the environment. How as humans do we respond to the environment? How do we, rather than thinking about purely geoengineering may save us all, how do we respond in the moment? How do we respond in the here and now? As I said earlier, how do we forge conversations together about what it feels like and what it actually means to be human within a technological society that is, some scientists would say is already over the precipice. We're already in free fall, but there is an affective experience that goes with that because we are humans. We respond on an emotional level rather than purely a cognitive level.
Yeah, it's not just the technical
Yes.
or the factual. There is for us an emotional element involved in it, isn't there? I mean, one of the things I did notice when I was actually looking at your work online, and I think this might sort of in a sense perhaps tie into what you're saying there, is that photographers can sometimes, when they're showing their work, they will almost put an explanation along with the image to try and sort of elaborate a little bit on what they're showing. But with your images, you've not got any text alongside them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what can you tell us about that decision? Is that sort of related to letting people take from it what they will rather than have that almost like, I guess, the technical, the scientific influence?
For me, photography is about focused attention, and that focused attention can be whilst I'm out for a walk, or can be just a moment of time. And during that moment when I'm actually taking the photograph, I don't think purely about the technical. And the reason why I don't put text generally next to my images is because I feel that text itself is a symbol. Language, semantics, linguistics is a symbol in its own right. And I would question whether that is visually artistic. I like to think that when we create works of art, we create photographs. There is a resonance with the image with ourselves, but there's also a triangulation between the observer, and what the observer brings to the photograph will be unique. So whilst I may have initially an idea about what my image is and how it speaks to me, that isn't necessarily how it speaks to the observer or the viewer. So I like to keep that playfulness and that sense of whatever the person brings to the image is of value, and it isn't about me, dare I say, colonizing the image by putting my own interpretation next to it.
Yeah, I fully understand that, and I'm almost tempted now to go and take all the text away from all of my because it's absolutely, it should be for, like you say, sort of what the viewer brings to it and takes from it is very if there is no sort of text influence there, could be completely different to had there been words to go along with the work.
Yeah, I suppose for me as well, it's when I take an image, one point of view is photography is memory, and the image is a memory of my experience, but it has its own, it is a fragment of my experience, but in the viewing, it has its own life. In that triangulation between the viewer and myself, it starts to engender something new, almost like planting a seed in the garden. It starts to forge its own identity. It starts to develop anew between the viewing. And I like that idea of something growing, something which is commenced by the image, but over time can develop within the mind of the viewer. And often when I return to my work, I think again there's a sense of when you take an image, if you put text next to it, you almost solidify the image. You say this is taken with a certain camera on a certain day using a certain f-stop. And that almost freezes the image in a certain time without allowing that sense of growth in the viewer. So that,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so sort of from that moment of conception almost of the image right through its life and how that image can even change for you.
Absolutely. Certainly when I take image, I have an idea of what the image is about. But when I return to an image months or years later, it's interesting to note, certainly for myself, about how that image has transformed its meaning over time, which makes me question, even when I take the image, how much do we fully know why we're taking the image? Not to get too, I suppose, psychoanalytical about it, but can we ever know fully what the image is about at the time, or do images have their own lives as they transform
Yeah,
over time?
absolutely. And I think that's a really good way for me to actually now sort of let you know some of the sort of images that I've looked at of yours. There's a few that I'd really just like to touch upon and see what you think from what I've sort of taken from it then, I guess. I mean, one of the works that I probably found, all of your work is fantastic to look at, but I think for me the ones that sort of the certain ones that perhaps stand out that might and others might find others stand out, but I was quite taken with the image called Solitary.
Yes.
And that's in a nutshell sort of description. It's a view of a lone figure in what looks like a part-tilled field, agricultural field, in a grey, quite flat landscape. And my imagination, I mean, just very briefly, my imagination almost initially wandered towards thoughts of books such as The Road.
Yes.
I don't know the
Yes.
Cormac McCarthy book, The Road, but not so much about the actual content of the book, but about that whole sort of sense of when something major has happened and the humankind is not as we know it, and people are trying to survive almost after a major disaster. It had that sense of and I maybe sort of, as you were saying earlier, that it sort of had a sense to me when I looked at it because of the light and the colours, and possibly even the flatness of the landscape, and definitely the single figure, that there was that trying, sort of almost like someone trying to continue on with life. And I guess given the current situation, the world faces, we sort of touched on that before, how does that influence your thinking in relation to your image making now then? I mean, if I've taken something like that from that image and the pandemic that we've lived through, globally, how's that influencing your thought processes then?
And it's great to hear your interpretation of the image, Josie. Thanks for that. And thanks for your kind words about my other photographs. How it influences me now is in conversation. I think, well, it's great because, I have my own ideas about what Solitary was about when I took the image, and to hear your ideas, I think, well, together we can co-author, we can almost like co-author a shared experience about what that means. And as I said earlier, it develops a conversation that isn't frozen in the image. It develops a conversation about ecology. It develops a conversation about human positions within a partly tilled field, but that can be symbolic for many things. From not to, as I've said, solidify the image, but for me, I do have a lot of resonance with what you just said. But there's something about for us as a human species in the entire universe, as far as we're aware, quite alone in the universe, and we've only got one planet to live on, and how do we till the field of our earth? How do we till the field of our shared survival going forward?
Yeah, absolutely, and it is a really strong image, and does, I think, And I think this is why, you know, for photographers who are sort of working with an environmental ideas, sort of at the forefront of pushing that, you know, pushing what they do to create work. There are so many different aspects that are, you know, that can influence you, and you might not even be aware of those influences as well. Sort of through the creation of the work. I mean, one of the other images that I was taken with is the one called Burnished Woods.
Yes.
And I think that one is that there's almost that, so because of the colours within that, it almost has that surreal element.
Yes.
But also a sense of perhaps a sense of foreboding, because looking at the image, there's the unusual colouring, but there's also like a line of strong trees. But I did feel, for me, when I was looking at it, I could almost feel a sense, but I can just see through them. So there is a glimmer of hope.
Yes.
And I think that's, again, something you've said before. And obviously this is my reaction to looking at your work again. But with that one, because it's very different, I would say, in execution to solitary, was there anything that when you were creating with those colours that you were thinking then?
I suppose I'll reveal part of my own creative process in this. Burnished Woods was, for me, influenced by, there's a series of paintings by painter, probably lots of the audience are familiar with the work of Klimt, of Gustav Klimt. And Gustav Klimt did some paintings around Buchenwald forest.
Okay.
And I just thought, when I looked at the paintings by Klimt, I thought how beautiful they were, how from an aesthetic point of view they were absolutely lovely to look at and to explore with the eye, but contrasted with the knowledge I had of, you know, Buchenwald being a concentration camp during the Second World War. So you have, you know, I had a sense of beauty in the image, but at the same time, the actual horror and repulsion of the connection with the concentration camp. So that paradox of feelings for me was something, again, which resonated with the current climate change position we find ourselves in. How do we forge beauty? How do we, the notion of burnished woods, you know, how do we retain a sense of wonder in front of nature? How do we retain that sense of beauty and awe when we're faced with the natural world, even whilst holding knowledge of something potentially horrific from the science? So you have that paradox and that polarity of position in the image, which I think is something which we all need to work through going forward. You know, how can we retain a sense of beauty and a sense of what's the word? I think the word, the word I'm searching for is, how do we hold on to wonder? How do we hold on to belief? And how do we just get through the days and the weeks and the months ahead with a scientific knowledge that runs parallel to our aesthetic experience?
Do you feel at all, when you do see images, particularly perhaps images that are more documentary in style, that are trying to sort of show people what's happening in relation to climate change, resource pressures, do you sometimes find if the more sort of straight documentary style is informative, but couldn't sometimes, because I think you know, one of the one of the expressions that came up, over the years has been in relation to charity giving was almost charity fatigue. So,
Yes.
This sense that in the world we live in, where photography is at one moment one of the most sort of hugest influences in all our lives, whether we realize it or not, but also at the same time, because of that, we can potentially be overwhelmed by the visual.
Yes.
So where would you say, or how do you feel that sort of the documentary of climate issues sits alongside perhaps what we would class as the more creative, artistic elements of talking about environmental issues in a creative way?
I think it has its place. I still return to the works of the great photographers like Don McCullen or James Nachtwey, who've done a lot of portrayal of war and the horrors associated with war. And I'm still very moved by those images. But like you said, I think, now there are so many distractions for us as individuals, with our daily routines and devices. There is almost a fatigue that goes, as you've rightly said, there is a fatigue that goes with seeing abject horror in front of our eyes. And I like to think, well, it has its place, but for me, it's also about how do we hook others in through a curiosity into the image?
Yes.
How do we hook individuals into developing conversations with artists around beauty and curiosity and not knowing directly what the image is about, but allowing that conversation to develop over time again. So I think it's a different starting place, even though we may have shared goals in mind about portraying where we're all at currently.
Yes. Yeah. And I would say from some of the works that you have shared on your website, then there are images such as Dark and the Deluge as well, which are probably more abstract in form.
Yes.
And that is the sort of work that you perhaps say could potentially spark more curiosity, so more asking of questions, what is this about, but also then going back to allowing the viewer to to sort of make up their own stories around the work as well.
Yes.
I mean, is that what you're actually hoping to do with the more abstract elements then, is to sort of garner this curiosity and interest in the image itself, and that then leads to a further conversation?
Absolutely. Yes. When I look at Deluge, I think, what is it? Is it almost like a satellite image of an ocean? Does it have connotations with almost biblical knowledge, biblical stories of the Great Flood? And is it more about, rock and stratas of rock? So that not knowing is something which is important to bear. I think lots of individuals search for certainty and for comfort, but we have to bear the not knowing in order to develop ourselves, and in order to foster resilience, we have to at times live without certainty.
Yes, and I guess that is for us all at the moment, in a sense, is something that we're actually all doing, regardless of where our our interests even lie. Obviously, most people were not expecting a pandemic to strike in 2020, and that's changed lives in all sorts of ways. And I guess it is sort of maybe touching on this communal, global, how do we build resilience out of this? How do we sort of move forward from it? bearing in mind all the people's different stories, different experiences of the situation, and doing that sort of together.
Yes.
And I guess for us as working in photography, it's how we can use that aspect of our lives to support that. So do you actually think that photography, I mean, obviously we're aware of the influence it's had since its invention on our lives, but do you feel that as photographers and as photographic artists, we can have an impact on environmental situations, and what difference, if any, photography can really make on a communal, not necessarily an individual basis?
I like to think we can have some impact and that we can offer some solace, at very least, going forward. I'm not sure is the honest answer, whether anything is of importance going forward. Is a question for all of us, but we all have to find meaning. We all have to find meaning in our lives, rather than returning to the climate science. I think often people can be deeply hurt by what they read, and they can have a sense of, how did this happen? How did we arrive at where we currently are? But is that sense of feeling perplexed, whilst it's a natural position, is it of any utility to remain perplexed forever, or can we give our focus to something that has meaning, that has some kind of resonance, that can build up that sense of community, even for those who only have a passing interest in art? We're a minority group, photographers, even within the world of fine art, perhaps. But I like to think with the advent of the smartphone, lots of people are getting increasingly into photography, so we can going forward rely on people's curiosity. We can think, well, there is almost like a world community that has an interest in the visual arts, and perhaps through that interest we can build on the sense of developing community.
Yeah. Do you, for you yourself then, and sort of the way you're working, do you have any sort of plans to do long-term projects, or do you prefer to do individual images? As you say, if you were out on a walk and something in that moment worked for you to create an image, is there a preference then for sort of the short-term or long-term project working?
It's an interesting question. I think all my work is long-term. As long as I'm alive, I'll be making art. So the nature of short-term and long-term doesn't often come into the foreground of my thinking. I like to think of it as I make art that's meaningful for me, and how we bracket the experience of what we do is another question. I think some of the core elements that have run through my work over several years have been concern about the environment, interest in the abstract notions of human experience. By that I mean things like, how do we respond to on an emotional level rather than purely an intellectual level. So that's some of the long-term strands that run through my work. Notions of photographic commissions. I'm always open to photographic commissions. So if someone wants to bracket my work from their own position, that's fine by me.
Yeah. Absolutely. So when people want to find out more about your work, then, I mean, I know that you have exhibited widely with your images, and I think probably, like many of us last year, certain shows were curtailed,
Yes.
or delayed, etc. Where have you shown work, and what's sort of coming up next? Where can is there anything on the horizon?
Yeah, there's been quite a step change, I think, during the pandemic time. Lots of work has moved online now because of coronavirus and the necessity for social distancing. So it remains to be seen how galleries will emerge from the pandemic. If people want to see my work, they can go to my website, photographerlight.com, where I've exhibited in the past. I've exhibited at a few galleries up and down the country. One of my recent images, The Deluge, was hosted online at a gallery called Antella Solace Gallery in Otherpool in Scotland, who had an online exhibition, group exhibition, and I'm part of that community virtually, as it were.
Fantastic.
As I said, I have exhibited as part of a Brighton exhibition a couple of years ago, and I've exhibited in the photography show in the NEC in Birmingham in 2018. Also part of the Let's Talk About the Anthropocene exhibition at the University of Brighton back in 2019. Seems a different light. It seems a lifetime ago, doesn't it? Pre-pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be interesting maybe I think that interview, is there a transcript of that interview on your website?
Yes, there is.
Right?
That's right. So a few stumbling words from myself I've repeated. So if people are really bored, they can read some of.
No, not at all. But I think it'd be really interesting to almost, if you read that with the mindset that was 2019, it's almost there is almost a line, isn't there, from that was then and this is now. I guess is sort of how many people are viewing this moment in our lifetimes.
Absolutely.
But I'm quite interested really there when we were talking about the fact that many shows have gone online. I mean, one show that I'm involved in, that the whole thing has been online, and actually it enabled the gallery to extend it as well, to have it sort of on show for longer. Although they actually did create a physical show and then obviously had to change things, so they did one of those virtual tours. So I'm quite fascinated now in the sense of and it's always about balance and compromise, I think, when you're working in photography, because all of this is this technology that is now allowing us to actually maybe make things more accessible, or maybe have the in-person show go out to a wider audience. All the sort of positives from that versus there's perhaps any negatives from that. And you could, I guess, talk about, well, all the technology that we use at some point is having an environmental impact in some way or another. We couldn't be talking now unless we had things in mobile phones and computers that come from natural resources, for instance. So there's all these sort of compromises we have to make, and I guess that perhaps I don't know how you feel, but it sort of almost takes us full circle back to how we started the conversation.
Yes, I'm not sure what I think about online. I see it's imperative during times of pandemic, and it does potentially open up images for a wider audience, but it also introduces, rather than seeing a work of art in a gallery, it also introduces the element of the screen that is hosting the image, as it were. Have individuals got the color balance right on the machine, and the machine and the frame of the machine that the image is being viewed through, it's almost like it creates a third object. So not only do you have the relationship with the artwork that you're viewing, you also have the relationship with the technology that you're viewing the artwork through, which brings another layer into the work. So I think, something interesting to explore going forward about introducing, rather than the work of art and the viewer, introducing the work of art, the viewer, and the viewing object. You create a third dimension in the interplay between the artist and the viewer, which, like I said, I'm still working that through myself.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think there's going to be quite a lot of sort of unpacking and exploration, and yeah, definitely whether it could work for some but wouldn't work for others. And I think there is no right or wrong, which I think from that's what we need to take. It's and I do sort of feel like you say it's a great way to make things accessible for more people if they have access, obviously, themselves to internet and computers and what have you, and but also the the sort of the tangible, although I guess you don't necessarily go up to an image on a wall and touch it. It is sort of more sort of a hands-on sense, I guess.
Yes.
A tactile, I think, is
yes.
It seems more tactile.
Yes, I think there's also something, we go to art galleries, we historically went to art galleries to view images. So part of viewing images involved almost a bit of a sacred pilgrimage, if I dare use those words, to view an art gallery, whereas now we can just lounge on the sofa and view an image on the screen. So it doesn't demand so much of all of us to view art, which, like you said, I think has its has a range of has a range of feelings attached to it. It's both easy to do, but also we lose something through it's coming to us rather than us going to view the images. I don't know.
And I suppose it's that sense, almost a sense like if we're working to raise awareness around or push ideas, or just even sort of prod someone to start thinking about environmental matters through our work. It's almost as well, considering, well, in which environment ourselves are we showing our work.
Yes.
I've always had sort of visions of showing work outside in forests and in fields, and so there is that all those different aspects, I guess, are a little bit curtailed about how we can even show work just right at this moment. So we shall fingers crossed, David, that for everyone we will get to a better place with this sort of pandemic situation.
Absolutely. As long as we retain a degree of impetus to human abilities to we've, as a species, we've been through very dark times historically, and I do have a slither of optimism that hopefully some innovation will come along that will allow us to continue to make art and to appreciate art.
Absolutely. Definitely, I agree with you. Well, just finally, I think you actually did mention your website, but just for clarity, can you just reiterate where people can go to find out more about your work and how you work?
Yes, if people type in photographerlight.com, which is photographer Light, light.com, they'll be able to view my images online and find out more about me. And I welcome any communication, even if it's just to say hello. It's good to talk. And I'm always open to developing future conversations, so I'd welcome any opportunity to have a conversation. And I appreciate you reaching out, Josie. It's great I certainly looked at your work and your website, and I found lots of intriguing images. I was very struck by lots of your own work and what you said about the position of sand was something I wasn't aware of previously. No doubt you'll be able to speak more about that with individuals. I found that very intriguing. So just a shout out to you as well. It's great work, and I certainly learned about the position of sand from your website. So thanks for that, Josie, as well.
Oh, David, thank you. That's really kind of you, and I'm glad. I mean, I think that's for all of us. If you know it, someone has. It affects someone in some way, then that's all we can really ask for, isn't it, through our work. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And yes, the global sand crisis is an issue we could potentially have a chat about, but I think with all of these things, I could definitely talk to you so much longer about sort of the work and the thoughts behind it and all of the aspects of that. So I really do appreciate it, and I just hope that this will spark conversations for people, and also make sure people go and have a look at what you're doing, because for everybody who's working in photography and trying to use it to highlight an environmental matter of whatever nature, then these conversations will hopefully help spread the word, and we can all chat, whether it be online or in person one day.
Yes, that would be good.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you, David. Thank
you
for
Josie.
taking part.